June 6, 1918, 0500, Wheatfield west of Belleau Wood, France. Captain Lloyd Williams of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment, lay in a shallow shell crater, his face pressed against the cold French earth. 48 hours earlier, his company had marched down a dusty road under the June sun, singing songs. Now before him stretched a wheat field 400 yards wide, golden, seemingly idyllic, swaying in the morning breeze. Beyond that field loomed the woods. The Germans called it Belleau Wood. The French called it Bois de Belleau. For the Marines, it would simply become hell. Williams raised his binoculars. The woods looked dead, mutilated trunks, branches shattered by artillery. But he knew that there, in that darkness, sat men. Germans, veterans, the 5th Guard Division, machine gunners who had survived Verdun and the Somme, men who for 3 years had been converting Frenchmen and Englishmen into statistics. They had dug positions into rocky ground, camouflaged firing points among boulders the size of men, ranged every meter of the approaches, waiting. The order was simple to the point of absurdity: attack frontally, across open ground, in daylight. Without tanks, the Americans had none. Without adequate artillery preparation, shells were scarce. Without experience in assaulting fortified positions, most of his men 3 months ago had been clerks, farmers, students. Open warfare, General Pershing had said. Aggressive spirit, they had drilled at training camps. The rifle and bayonet will decide the outcome. Williams lowered his binoculars. Behind him, in the folds of the terrain, 300 men of his company lay prone. Average age, 22. They joked, smoked, checked cartridges in their Springfield M1903 clips. Some wrote final letters home. They believed in their invincibility. They were Americans. They were Marines. They did not know that in 3 weeks, 2/3 of them would be dead or wounded. They did not know that this woods would enter history as the place where the American Army would pay the highest price per square yard of ground in the entire First World War. Artillery opened fire, a short, ineffective barrage. Shells burst somewhere deep in the woods, not touching the forward German positions. Williams checked his watch. 05:45. Whistle. Time to stand up. This captain did not yet understand that his courage, the discipline of his men, and faith in American superiority would collide not with an abstract enemy, but with the mathematics of industrial killing. With the trajectory of MG-0815 machine gun bursts, with a fire density of 600 rounds per minute per meter of front, with 3 years of German expertise in the methodical annihilation of advancing infantry. Courage would prove a constant, tactics a variable. And the price of this lesson would be measured not in yards of captured territory, but in bodies left lying in the wheat under the June sun. The Marines who prepared to cross that wheat field on June 6, 1918, carried with them more than Springfield rifles and bayonets. They carried an entire philosophy of war, one forged in the training camps of Quantico and Paris Island, distilled from the lectures of General John J. Pershing, and rooted in a peculiarly American faith in the offensive spirit. This doctrine had a name: open warfare. And it was about to collide with a killing system perfected over 4 years of European bloodletting. Pershing's vision was seductive in its simplicity. The Allied armies, French, British, had become paralyzed, he argued, by their obsession with trench warfare, with methodical artillery preparations, with cautious advances measured in yards. They had forgotten the fundamentals: marksmanship, fire, and movement, the aggressive rifle charge. American soldiers, unburdened by European pessimism, would break the stalemate through sheer audacity and superior individual fighting ability. The bayonet would triumph over the machine gun. Morale would overcome firepower. This was not merely tactical preference, it was ideological. Pershing saw trench warfare as a European disease, a symptom of old world exhaustion, of nations that had bled themselves into defensive paralysis. Americans would fight differently. They would restore mobility to the battlefield. They would win through offensive elan, not through grinding attrition. There was one problem with this vision. It was approximately 3 years out of date. By June 1918, the Germans had transformed defensive warfare into an exact science. Their positions at Belleau Wood were not merely trenches, but layered killing zones. The forward edge consisted of mutually supporting machine gun nests, positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. These were not exposed positions, but reinforced dugouts carved into rocky outcroppings, immune to all but direct artillery hits. Behind them lay successive defensive lines, fallback positions, pre-registered for mortar and artillery support. The entire system was designed around a single principle: maximize casualties on attacking infantry before they could close to rifle range. The mathematics were brutal and precise. A single MG-08-15 machine gun could fire 450 rounds per minute with effective accuracy to 2,000 meters. A well-trained crew could sustain fire for hours, changing barrels every 1,000 rounds. German doctrine called for machine gun density of 1 gun per 40 meters of front. At Belleau Wood, they had exceeded this standard. The result was a fire zone where survival time for exposed infantry could be measured in seconds, not minutes. Against this system, the Marines would attack with tactics that might have worked at Gettysburg. They would advance in waves, at walking pace, maintaining unit cohesion. They would rely on individual marksmanship. The Springfield M1903 was indeed an excellent rifle, accurate to 600 yards. They would close with the enemy and decide the matter with cold steel. It was a doctrine built for an enemy who stood and fought, not one who hid in reinforced positions and fired from concealment. The few officers who had studied European battle reports understood the disparity, but their warnings had been dismissed. Pershing believed, genuinely believed, that Allied failures stemmed from lack of offensive spirit, not from tactical reality. And so the 2nd Division, including the 4th Marine Brigade, had been trained not in the infiltration tactics the Germans themselves had developed, not in the artillery-infantry coordination the French had perfected through bloody trial, but in the ghost of warfare past. The irony would become apparent in the wheat field. The Marines were superbly trained soldiers. Their marksmanship standards exceeded those of any other American unit. Their physical conditioning was outstanding. Their morale was unshakable. None of this mattered. A motivated rifleman advancing across open ground against a concealed machine gun was not engaged in combat. He was engaged in suicide, slowed to walking pace. At 0500 on June 6th, the Marines of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Regiment rose from their positions and began to advance across the wheat field toward Lucy-le-Bocage, the first objective before Belleau Wood itself. They moved in waves, 50 yards between lines, maintaining perfect parade ground formation. The wheat was waist-high, golden in the early morning light. For perhaps 30 seconds, it was almost peaceful. Then the German machine guns opened fire. The sound was unlike anything the Marines had heard in training. Not the crisp crack of rifle fire, but a sustained mechanical roar, a chainsaw sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The wheat in front of the leading wave began to dance as if swept by invisible scythes. Men fell in clumps, in entire squads. Some fell silently, killed instantly. Others screamed, gut-shot, thrashing in the wheat. The advance continued. This was doctrine. Maintain momentum, close the distance, don't seek cover. Keep moving forward. They moved forward and died in arithmetic progression. The German machine gunners were not shooting at individual targets. They were traversing their weapons in methodical arcs, firing at chest height, letting the advancing Americans walk into pre-ranged fire lanes. It was not combat. It was mechanical slaughter, industrial in its efficiency. A single well-positioned MG-0815 could sweep a front of 50 yards, firing 600 rounds per minute. The Germans at Lucy-le-Bocage had 24 such guns. The mathematics were inescapable. Second Lieutenant Clifton Cates, leading a platoon in the first wave, watched his command dissolve around him. Of the 42 men who had started the advance with him, 31 fell in the first 200 yards. He himself was hit twice. A bullet through the helmet that creased his skull, another through his uniform that somehow missed flesh. He would survive to become Commandant of the Marine Corps. Of the others, most would never leave France. The survivors reached a slight depression in the ground, not a trench, merely a fold in the terrain offering 6 inches of defilade. Here they stopped, not by order, but by instinct, the animal brain overriding training. To advance further was demonstrably fatal. To retreat was unthinkable. They lay in that depression for hours under the June sun, unable to move forward or back, while German artillery began to range in on their position. This was the reality of open warfare against prepared defenses. Not decisive breakthrough, but entrapment in the killing zone. By noon, the 3rd Battalion had suffered 60% casualties. They had advanced 400 yards. Lucy-le-Bocage remained in German hands. The battalion commander was dead, shot through the head while attempting to organize a renewed assault. The assault failed. The Germans counterattacked at dusk, were repulsed by rifle fire. Here, finally, the Springfield proved its worth. But the Marines were spent, fixed in position, unable to advance or withdraw. This was the pattern that would repeat for 20 days. The Marines would attack Belleau Wood itself in the same manner. Frontal assaults, across open ground, against prepared positions. They would attack because doctrine demanded offense, because Pershing's philosophy permitted no alternative, because to admit the futility of such tactics was to admit that American methods were no improvement over European defeatism. And they would pay. Company-level casualty rates at Belleau Wood would exceed 90%. Battalions would be reduced to company strength. The 5th Marine Regiment, which entered the battle with 3,000 men, would suffer 1,087 casualties in 3 weeks, a rate of attrition higher than the British suffered at the Somme. For what? A woods barely a square mile in size, of no strategic significance, which could have been bypassed or starved out with minimal casualties. But numbers alone do not capture the texture of the killing. Consider one detail. The Marines attacked in daylight, following doctrine. The Germans, when they counterattacked, came at night or dawn, using infiltration tactics. Consider another. Marine units attacked with officers leading from the front, maintaining visible command presence. German officers directed fire from concealed positions. The doctrinal gap was not merely tactical, but philosophical. One side fighting a war of heroic gesture, the other fighting a war of industrial efficiency. Belleau Wood itself was not one battle, but a series of frenzied, close-quarters engagements spread across 20 days. The trees, those that remained after preliminary bombardment, were mostly oak and beech, planted in neat rows decades before by French foresters. The Germans had converted this geometric forest into a fortress. Every rocky outcropping concealed a machine gun nest. Every clearing was pre-ranged for mortar fire. The underbrush had been cleared to create killing zones, while the Germans themselves remained invisible in reinforced positions. The Marines entered this nightmare on June 6th and would not emerge until June 26th. The fighting defied conventional military description. Units became intermingled. Company commanders lost contact with their platoons. Small groups of Marines would seize a position, only to be isolated and destroyed by German counterattacks. Gains measured in yards were lost, retaken, lost again. The Germans did not merely defend, they counterattacked with systematic precision, reclaiming lost ground before the Marines could consolidate. Gunnery Sergeant Dan Daly, a Medal of Honor recipient from previous campaigns, found himself leading a platoon in an assault on the 11th of June. His words, shouted to hesitant men pinned by machine gun fire, entered Marine Corps legend. "Come on, you sons of bitches. Do you want to live forever?" They rose and followed him. Half died in the next 50 yards. Daly survived. His words survived. The mythology grew. What the mythology obscured was the futility. That position, once taken, was abandoned 2 days later due to German counterattack and artillery. The reality was less cinematic. Marines advanced through woods where visibility was measured in meters, where every fallen log might conceal a German rifleman, where machine gun fire seemed to come from trees themselves. They fought with rifles, bayonets, grenades, and, when those ran out, with entrenching tools and rocks. German snipers picked off officers. German machine gunners waited until Marine squads were at point-blank range before opening fire, maximizing casualties. Wounded men lay between the lines for days, calling for help that could not reach them without drawing fire. The Americans adapted, slowly and bloodily. They learned to advance not in lines, but in small teams, using fire and movement. They learned to suppress machine gun positions with automatic rifle fire. The new Browning automatic rifle, or BR, proved invaluable here, while other teams maneuvered. They learned to attack at dawn, not noon, using whatever concealment the terrain offered. They learned, in short, the lessons the British and French had paid for in 1915 and 1916. But they learned on their feet, under fire, while men died from preventable mistakes. Consider the arithmetic of this learning curve. On June 6th, the Marines attacked in parade ground formation and suffered catastrophic casualties. By June 25th, they were using infiltration tactics and combined arms coordination. The improvement was genuine, but the price was paid up front. An experienced European division, using proven tactics from the start, might have taken Belleau Wood in a week with a third the casualties. The Marines took 3 weeks and suffered 1,811 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing, from a brigade that started at 8,000 men. This was the mathematics of learning through bloodshed. Yet they persisted. This persistence was not irrational. It was doctrinal. Pershing's philosophy held that morale and determination could compensate for tactical deficiency. The Marines proved him half right. They did take Belleau Wood. They did not break. But the cost, the human cost, was staggering. And the question remained, was this victory worth the price? Or merely proof that sufficient casualties applied to any problem will eventually produce a solution? To understand the full dimension of the American tactical failure at Belleau Wood, one must examine the battle from the German side. The defenders were not supermen. They were soldiers of the 461st Imperial German Infantry Regiment and the 10th, 40th, and 197th Divisions. Experienced units, yes, but exhausted from 4 years of war, outnumbered, operating at the end of a failing supply line. They watched the Americans attack with a mixture of professional admiration and disbelief. A German machine gunner, whose account was captured in post-war interviews, described the opening American assaults as incomprehensible. The Marines advanced, he noted, with extraordinary courage, but with tactics that seemed designed to maximize their own casualties. They came in waves, maintaining formation, refusing to take cover, presenting targets that even a mediocre gunner could not miss. His unit, he reported, was filled not with triumph, but with a kind of horror at the slaughter they were inflicting. These were not poorly trained conscripts stumbling forward. These were clearly elite troops, well-equipped, physically formidable, and being fed into machine gun fire through sheer tactical stubbornness. Another German officer, in his after-action report, expressed grudging respect for American tenacity, while noting that such tenacity, divorced from tactical sophistication, merely increased friendly casualties without corresponding military gain. He compared the American attacks to the French assaults of 1915. The same willingness to accept catastrophic losses, the same faith in morale over method. The French, he noted, had learned. The Americans were now repeating the same curriculum. The German defenders held not through superior numbers, they were outnumbered, but through superior preparation and doctrine. They had positioned their machine guns in depth, so that even when the Marines overran forward positions, they encountered fresh defensive lines. They had pre-positioned ammunition and supplies in dugouts immune to American artillery. They counterattacked not in massive waves, but in small coordinated groups designed to isolate and destroy American penetrations. Most critically, they understood the principle of defense in depth. The goal was not to hold every meter of ground, but to maximize enemy casualties while preserving German forces. This defensive doctrine was itself a product of mathematics. By 1918, the Germans had calculated that in a prepared defensive position, one defender with automatic weapons could kill or wound 10 attackers advancing across open ground. The ratio held at Belleau Wood. The Marines achieved eventual victory through sheer numerical superiority, replacing casualties with fresh troops. But the exchange rate remained appalling. For every German killed or captured, 3 to 4 Marines fell. This was not a tactical victory. It was attrition warfare, won by the side with deeper reserves. The German accounts contain one recurring theme: astonishment at American refusal to adapt. The British, they noted, had long since abandoned frontal assaults in favor of artillery-led advances and infiltration tactics. The French had developed methodical, step-by-step procedures for reducing fortified positions. The Americans attacked as if none of this experience existed, as if will alone could overcome defensive firepower. One German report concluded, almost sympathetically, that the Americans were brave to the point of stupidity. While Marines died in the wheat fields and woods, a parallel battle raged in headquarters tents behind the lines. This was the battle between American doctrine and European experience, between Pershing's vision and tactical reality. And in this battle, the commanding general of the 2nd Division, Major General Omar Bundy, found himself caught between irreconcilable demands. Bundy had been ordered to take Belleau Wood. The French High Command, panicked by the German spring offensive that had brought enemy forces to within 50 miles of Paris, needed a victory, any victory, to demonstrate that the front was stabilizing. The American Expeditionary Forces Command, meaning Pershing, needed a victory to prove that American troops could fight independently, that they were not mere reinforcements for exhausted Allied armies. Both commands demanded offensive action. Neither provided adequate artillery support, replacements, or time for proper reconnaissance. The tactical situation was impossible. Belleau Wood was a fortified position of no strategic value, which could have been isolated and bypassed. But bypassing was not politically acceptable. The French needed an immediate offensive success. Pershing needed to demonstrate American offensive spirit. And so Bundy ordered attacks that he knew, from reports filtering back from the front, were producing catastrophic casualties. He ordered them because doctrine demanded offense, because his superiors demanded results, because the alternative, admitting that American tactics were inadequate, was career-ending and philosophically unacceptable. The Marine Brigade commander, Brigadier General James Harbord, implemented these orders with grim determination. Harbord was not a fool. He understood that frontal assaults against prepared positions were producing unacceptable losses. But he also understood that he commanded Marines, an elite force whose reputation demanded that they succeed where others had failed. To question tactics, to advocate for delay or methodical reduction of the German position, would be seen as defeatism. And so he ordered attack after attack, replacing shattered battalions with fresh companies, feeding men into the woods in increments sufficient to sustain momentum, but insufficient to achieve breakthrough. The result was a battle conducted on institutional momentum rather than tactical sense. Units attacked because they had been ordered to attack, because doctrine permitted no other response to enemy resistance. Company commanders, watching their units dissolve under machine gun fire, called for artillery support that did not exist, for reinforcements that arrived too slowly, for ammunition that was consumed faster than it could be supplied. They improvised, adapted, learned, but always within the framework of an offensive that should never have been conducted in the manner it was. One Marine captain, whose company suffered 80% casualties in 3 days, wrote in his report that his men had displayed extraordinary courage and that the German position was eventually taken. He did not write, could not write, within the culture of the Corps, that the position could have been taken with 1/10 the casualties if proper artillery preparation had been conducted, if infiltration tactics had been employed from the start, if the American command had been willing to learn from 4 years of Allied experience. Such observations were tactically sound, but institutionally suicidal. The command failure at Belleau Wood was not a failure of individual officers, but of institutional culture. The American military in 1918 was not prepared to admit that its doctrine was flawed, that European methods, developed through millions of casualties, might be superior to American tradition. And so officers who recognized the futility of frontal assaults continued to order them, and men who understood they were being sent to pointless deaths continued to obey, because the alternative was to question the foundations of American military identity. By June 25, 1918, Belleau Wood was in American hands. The Germans had withdrawn, not because they were defeated in place, but because the strategic situation demanded consolidation of their lines. The Marines had achieved their objective. Casualty reports were being compiled. And in those reports lay the true story of the battle, not of heroic triumph, but of brutal arithmetic. The 4th Marine Brigade entered the battle with approximately 8,000 men. After 3 weeks, it had suffered 5,183 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. This represented a casualty rate of 65%, higher than any American unit would suffer in any comparable period for the remainder of the war. Of these casualties, 1,811 were from the fighting at Belleau Wood itself. The remainder came from the subsidiary actions around Bourges and the continued German artillery bombardment of positions supposedly secured. Break these numbers down further. The average Marine rifle company started the battle with 250 men. By the end, effective strength averaged 70 to 80. Some companies were reduced to 40 men, the size of a platoon. Battalion commanders were killed or wounded at a rate of nearly 100%. Company commanders at even higher rates. The leadership casualty rate was so severe that by the battle's end, lieutenants commanded companies and sergeants led platoons. What had been purchased with these casualties? A woods approximately 1 square mile in area, of no strategic significance, which the Germans abandoned voluntarily. The French officially renamed it Bois de la Brigade de Marine, in recognition of the Marines' sacrifice. This honor could not resurrect the dead or heal the wounded. It could not change the mathematical reality. The Marines had paid approximately 1,800 casualties per square kilometer of ground taken. By comparison, the German spring offensive, widely regarded as a tactical disaster, had cost the Germans approximately 230,000 casualties for 1,250 square kilometers gained, a rate of 184 casualties per square kilometer. The Marines at Belleau Wood had suffered 10 times the casualty rate of one of the war's bloodiest offensives. These numbers are not merely statistics. They represent a failure of doctrine, of preparation, of command. They represent the cost of sending elite troops into battle with inadequate tactics, insufficient artillery support, and a philosophy that valued offensive spirit over tactical sophistication. They represent the price of American exceptionalism, the belief that American methods, American courage, American vigor could overcome the hard lessons learned by European armies through 4 years of industrial slaughter. And yet, within the American military establishment, Belleau Wood was declared a victory. The Marines had proven their worth. American arms had succeeded where French and British forces had failed. The narrative was one of triumph, of determination overcoming adversity, casualty. Rates were acknowledged but attributed to German strength, to the difficulty of the terrain, to the fortunes of war, anything but to tactical inadequacy. This narrative mattered. It shaped how the American military understood its performance, how it trained for future battles, how it interpreted the lessons of the Great War. Belleau Wood became a foundational myth of the Marine Corps. Proof of the Corps' elite status, of its ability to accomplish impossible missions through sheer determination. The myth was not false exactly. The Marines had displayed extraordinary courage. They had taken their objective. But the myth obscured the cost, the preventable nature of much of that cost, and the tactical lessons that should have been learned. In the immediate aftermath of Belleau Wood, the Marine Corps was nearly destroyed as a fighting force. The 4th Brigade required complete reconstitution. Replacements, fresh recruits from the United States, had to be integrated into shattered units. Officers had to be replaced, NCOs promoted from the ranks, unit cohesion rebuilt. This process took months. The brigade would not return to full effectiveness until September 1918, effectively missing the crucial battles of the summer. The German spring offensive had been stopped, not at Belleau Wood, but across a broad front through attrition and the arrival of American reinforcements. Belleau Wood was tactically irrelevant to this larger outcome. What it demonstrated was that American troops could fight. A demonstration purchased at catastrophic cost, but politically necessary. The battle reassured the French, confirmed American resolve, and provided a propaganda victory at a moment when Allied morale desperately needed one. American newspapers seized on Belleau Wood as proof of American martial virtue. The Marines became devil dogs, a nickname allegedly given by German troops, though the evidence for this is thin. Stories of individual heroism proliferated, often embellished. Sergeant Dan Daly's exhortation became famous. The image of Marines charging through German machine gun fire, refusing to retreat, became iconic. These stories were true in their broad outlines, but they omitted the context. That such charges were necessary because American tactics made them necessary. That German defenders were astonished at American willingness to accept such casualties. That a different approach might have achieved the same result at a fraction of the cost. Within the Marine Corps, Belleau Wood became sacred ground. It was the battle that proved the Corps' elite status, that distinguished Marines from regular Army infantry, that validated the Corps' warrior ethos. This mythology was not entirely cynical. The Marines genuinely had displayed extraordinary courage. But mythology, by definition, obscures complexity. The myth of Belleau Wood emphasized heroism while de-emphasizing failure. The failure of doctrine, of preparation, of tactical imagination. The German perspective was recorded in after-action reports and post-war accounts. They acknowledged that the Americans fought with admirable courage. They noted that American troops did not break under fire, did not surrender en masse, maintained offensive pressure despite catastrophic casualties. But they also concluded that the Americans were tactically naive, that they attacked with methods long since discredited, that their command displayed rigidity in the face of failure. One German officer summarized the American performance as first-rate troops, third-rate tactics. This assessment was not shared by American leadership. Pershing visited the battlefield after its capture and declared the action a vindication of his doctrine of open warfare. The Marines, he noted, had taken a fortified position through aggressive assault, proof that American methods worked. The casualties were regrettable but acceptable, the price of offensive victory. This interpretation became official. Belleau Wood was taught at military academies as an example of successful offensive operations, of Marine Corps valor, of American victory. The tactical failures were acknowledged only obliquely, if at all. Decades later, military historians would re-examine Belleau Wood with the detachment that contemporary participants lacked. Their verdict was more nuanced than the immediate post-war mythology. Belleau Wood, they concluded, was both a victory and a warning, a demonstration of American fighting spirit and a cautionary tale about the cost of tactical rigidity. The battle revealed critical weaknesses in American military preparation. The Army had entered the war with doctrine based on theoretical principles rather than contemporary combat experience. Pershing's open warfare philosophy, whatever its merits in mobile operations, was catastrophically inappropriate for reducing fortified positions. The Americans had ignored or dismissed 4 years of Allied tactical development, infiltration tactics, artillery-infantry coordination, combined arms integration in favor of doctrinal purity. Belleau Wood was the tuition payment for this institutional arrogance. But the battle also revealed American strengths. The Marine Corps' training, while doctrinally flawed, had produced soldiers of exceptional physical and mental toughness. American troops did not break under conditions that had shattered less resilient forces. They adapted, at the small unit level, with remarkable speed. Sergeants and lieutenants developed solutions that their doctrine had not provided. Fire and movement, infiltration, combined small arms fire, often independently, often in defiance of orders. The American military's decentralized culture, which encouraged initiative at lower levels of command, proved invaluable in compensating for failures at higher levels. The casualty figures from Belleau Wood influenced American tactical development for the remainder of the war. By September 1918, during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, American units were employing tactics far more sophisticated than those used in June. They advanced behind creeping barrages, used tanks and aircraft for support, employed infiltration tactics to bypass strong points. The learning curve was steep and bloody, but the Americans did learn. Belleau Wood was where the tuition was paid. For the Marine Corps specifically, Belleau Wood became the defining moment of institutional identity. The Corps had existed since 1775, but had never participated in a major land battle on the scale of the Western Front. Belleau Wood established the Marines as an elite infantry force, capable of frontline combat against first-tier opponents. This reputation would shape Marine Corps culture for a century. The expectation of toughness, of accepting impossible missions, of refusing to acknowledge defeat. These were admirable qualities, but they also perpetuated a certain institutional stubbornness, a reluctance to question tactics when those tactics aligned with the Corps' self-image. The French, whose army had fought across the same terrain in 1914 and understood the cost of such battles, awarded the 4th Marine Brigade the Croix de Guerre, an extraordinary honor for a foreign unit. But French officers privately expressed bewilderment at American methods. They had learned through catastrophic losses in 1914 to 1915 that frontal assaults against prepared positions were suicidal. They had developed methodical tactics to minimize casualties. And now, they watched the Americans repeat their mistakes, paying the same price for the same lessons. One French general, in his memoirs, described the American performance at Belleau Wood as magnificent and terrible. Magnificent for its courage, terrible for its cost. On July 1st, 1918, the remnants of the 4th Marine Brigade were withdrawn from the line for reconstitution. They marched through French villages where civilians stood in silence, watching these Americans who had paid such a price. The Marines were filthy, exhausted, haunted by what they had seen. Of the men who had entered Belleau Wood 3 weeks earlier, less than half walked out intact. Some had been killed. Others lay in field hospitals, recovering from wounds or dying slowly from infections. Still others were simply gone, buried in shell craters or lost in the woods, their bodies never recovered. The survivors carried with them the knowledge that they had prevailed, that Belleau Wood had been taken, that the Germans had been driven back, that the line had held. This knowledge was real and important, but they also carried the memory of friends killed by tactics that should never have been employed, of attacks ordered despite obvious futility, of courage expended in service of doctrinal rigidity. These memories were not part of the official narrative. They lived in letters home, in conversations among veterans, in the silences that followed certain questions. Captain Lloyd Williams, who had lain in the wheat field on June 6th contemplating the coming assault, survived the battle. He would be killed 2 months later in a different action. But his words, spoken when a French officer suggested retreat, became part of Marine Corps legend. Retreat? Hell, we just got here. The quotation captured the Marine spirit, aggressive, defiant, refusing to accept defeat. It became a rallying cry, a statement of institutional identity. What it did not capture was the context. That the French officer's suggestion was tactically sound, that the position was untenable, that American stubbornness in that moment led to increased casualties without corresponding gain. Heroism and foolishness are sometimes separated by only the width of a wheat field. The final accounting of Belleau Wood cannot be made in tactical terms alone. The battle achieved its political objective. It demonstrated to the French, the British, and the Germans that American troops could fight. It provided a propaganda victory when the Allies desperately needed one. It established the Marine Corps as an elite force. These were real accomplishments with real strategic value. But they came at a cost, measured not in dollars or equipment, but in the bodies of young men who believed in their country, their corps and their commanders, and who paid for that belief in a wheat field in France. The woods that the French renamed Bois de la Brigade de Marine stand today as a memorial. Visitors can walk the same ground, see the same rocky outcroppings that concealed German machine guns, trace the same paths the Marines followed. The wheat fields are peaceful now, farmed by the descendants of those who watched the battle from their villages. Time has healed the landscape, but the cost remains, recorded in casualty lists, in cemetery records, in the rolls of the missing. 5,183 names. Each name a life, a family, a story that ended in France, because doctrine demanded sacrifice and courage provided it. This was the mathematics of Belleau Wood. Courage as a constant, tactics as a variable, casualties as the inevitable product. The Marines proved that American soldiers could match any enemy in determination and fighting spirit. They also proved that determination alone, without tactical sophistication, transforms soldiers into casualties. Both lessons were necessary. Both were true. And both were purchased at a price that should make any nation pause before sending its young men into battle unprepared for the reality they will face. The wheat fields of Belleau Wood remain a testament to American courage and to the cost of tactical naivety. A memorial not only to those who fought there, but to the hard truths that all nations must learn about modern war. That valor without wisdom is waste. That aggression without preparation is slaughter. And that the price of victory, when measured in unnecessary casualties, can be as haunting as the price of defeat.